Order in the court. Sergeant, your disrespect for these proceedings is alarming. I find you in contempt. Remove him from the courtroom immediately, bailiff.
Your Honor, this evidence confirms our position. We must admit it now.
The prosecution formally withdraws its objection, Your Honor.
Judge Thomas Whitmore slammed his gavel down in the Phoenix, Arizona Municipal Courtroom and cut off Sergeant Major Isaiah Washington mid-sentence. The white judge's face red with irritation as he said, "I don't care about your military service. I don't care about your excuses. And I frankly don't care about your attempts to explain yourself. What I care about is that you assaulted a police officer. You resisted arrest. And you're standing in my courtroom thinking that wearing your dress blues and displaying your medals is going to earn you some kind of special treatment. But let me be clear, in my courtroom, everyone is equal, which means your service doesn't make you better than anyone else and doesn't excuse criminal behavior. And I'm tired of veterans thinking they deserve special consideration. So I'm going to make an example of you. 30 days in county jail and a $5,000 fine, bailiff. Take him into custody." And the entire courtroom gasped because the 52-year-old black veteran in his military dress uniform, covered in ribbons and decorations, had been trying to explain that the police officer who arrested him had made a mistake, that Isaiah had been breaking up a fight at a gas station, and the responding officer had assumed he was the aggressor because of his race. But Judge Whitmore had refused to hear any of it, had dismissed Isaiah's public defender's objections, had ignored the security camera footage that the defense tried to present, and was now sending a decorated combat veteran to jail without even allowing him to speak in his own defense. And what Judge Whitmore didn't know, what his arrogance and his prejudice had prevented him from learning, was that Sergeant Major Isaiah Washington was not just any veteran. He was one of the most decorated soldiers in modern American military history. A Medal of Honor recipient who had saved 47 American lives in Afghanistan. And the final words Isaiah was about to speak were going to expose Judge Whitmore's bias in a way that would destroy his career, shame his family, and change the criminal justice system in Arizona forever. Isaiah stood perfectly still as the bailiff approached him, and his military bearing was evident in every line of his body, in the way he kept his shoulders back, and his chin up despite the humiliation of being sentenced to jail for a crime he didn't commit. And he looked directly at Judge Whitmore with eyes that had seen combat and death, and had learned not to flinch in the face of injustice. And he said in a voice that carried across the silent courtroom, "Your Honor, you have made it clear that you don't want to hear about my service, that you believe mentioning my military background is an attempt to manipulate this court. But I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for basic fairness. I'm asking to be allowed to present the evidence that proves my innocence. I'm asking for the same presumption of innocence that you would extend to someone who looks like you. And your refusal to hear that evidence, your dismissal of my attempts to speak, your assumption that I'm guilty before hearing my defense, that's not justice, that's prejudice. And I think you need to ask yourself whether you would be treating me this way if I were white." The courtroom went deathly silent, and Judge Whitmore's face went from red to purple with rage, and he started to respond, started to hold Isaiah in contempt of court for daring to accuse him of racism. But Isaiah held up his hand and said, "I'm not finished, Your Honor. You said you were going to make an example of me. And I think that's exactly what you should do, but not for the reasons you think. Make an example of me by actually looking at the evidence. By watching the security camera footage that shows I was defending a woman from being assaulted. By listening to the witness statements from the gas station employees who saw everything. By reading the police report that contradicts Officer Mitchell's version of events. And if after seeing all that evidence you still believe I'm guilty, then send me to jail. I'll accept that judgment. But if you refuse to even look at the evidence, if you sentence me without allowing me to present a defense, then you're not making an example of me. You're making an example of a broken justice system that treats black men as guilty until proven innocent. that values the word of a white police officer over the testimony of a black veteran, and that allows judges to let their personal biases determine outcomes rather than facts and evidence. Judge Whitmore was shaking with fury, and he opened his mouth to respond, but Isaiah continued, his voice gaining strength, gaining power, gaining the kind of authority that came from years of leading men in combat. "And Your Honor, you said that in your courtroom everyone is equal, that my service doesn't make me better than anyone else. And you're absolutely right, my service doesn't make me better, but it should make you think twice before assuming I'm a criminal. Because I've spent 30 years serving this country. I've been deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan 4 times. I've led soldiers in some of the most dangerous combat zones in the world. I've received the Medal of Honor for actions where I chose to run toward danger rather than away from it, where I put my body between enemy fire and my fellow soldiers, where I made decisions that saved American lives at the risk of my own. And I've done all of that while wearing the same uniform you're now using as evidence of my arrogance. And I'm not telling you this because I think it makes me special. I'm telling you this because it should give you pause. It should make you wonder whether your first instinct about me might be wrong, whether the police officer who arrested me might have made assumptions based on my race rather than my actions, whether you might be perpetuating an injustice rather than preventing one." The courtroom was absolutely riveted, spectators leaning forward in their seats, court reporters frozen with their hands over their keyboards, the prosecutor looking uncomfortable, Isaiah's public defender sitting with her mouth slightly open in shock, and Judge Whitmore was trapped, because if he cut Isaiah off now, if he held him in contempt for speaking truth, it would only prove Isaiah's point about bias. But if he let Isaiah continue, he was losing control of his courtroom, losing the authority he'd wielded so casually moments before. Isaiah saw the judge's hesitation, and he pressed forward, and his next words would be the ones that changed everything. The words that would be quoted in news articles and legal briefs and ethics investigations for years to come. "Your Honor, before you finalize your sentence, I want you to know something about the police officer who arrested me, Officer Derek Mitchell, and I want you to understand why he might have been particularly aggressive in his treatment of me 3 years ago. I filed a complaint against Officer Mitchell when I witnessed him using excessive force against a teenager during a traffic stop. I reported what I saw because, as a soldier, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution. And that oath didn't end when I left the military. It's a lifetime commitment to stand up against injustice wherever I see it. And Officer Mitchell has been looking for an opportunity to retaliate ever since. And last Tuesday night, he got that opportunity when he responded to a call at a gas station and saw me restraining a man who was attacking a woman. And instead of asking what was happening, instead of talking to witnesses, instead of checking the security cameras, Officer Mitchell assumed I was the aggressor, put me in handcuffs, charged me with assault and resisting arrest, and wrote a police report that contradicts every piece of physical evidence and every witness statement. And I think you need to ask yourself, Your Honor, why you're so willing to believe his version of events without even looking at the evidence that proves he's lying. Judge Whitmore's face had gone pale now, and he was gripping his gavel so hard his knuckles were white. Because if what Isaiah was saying was true, if there was evidence that contradicted the police report, if this was a retaliatory arrest, then Whitmore had been about to send an innocent man to jail. And more than that, he'd been about to send a Medal of Honor recipient to jail without even hearing his defense. And the optics of that, the potential fallout, the media attention, the scrutiny of his other cases. It was all crashing down on him, but he was still too proud, too arrogant, too invested in his authority to back down gracefully. Instead, he said, "Sergeant Washington, I appreciate your service to this country, but this is a court of law, not a military tribunal, and your accusations against Officer Mitchell are not evidence. They're conjecture, and unless your attorney can present actual evidence, I'm going to proceed with sentencing." Isaiah looked at his public defender, a young white woman named Rachel Martinez, who was clearly overwhelmed by the case, but who now stood up and said, her voice shaking slightly. "Your Honor, I've been trying to present evidence since the beginning of this hearing. I have the security camera footage on a USB drive. I have written statements from 3 witnesses who were at the gas station. I have the victim's statement thanking Mr. Washington for saving her from assault. And I have Officer Mitchell's previous disciplinary record showing a pattern of excessive force complaints. And I've been attempting to enter all of this into evidence. But you've sustained every objection from the prosecutor, and you've refused to allow me to play the video or call the witnesses. And I'm formally requesting a continuance so that this evidence can be properly reviewed, because sentencing my client to jail without considering exculpatory evidence would be a miscarriage of justice." The prosecutor, a tired-looking man named David Chen, who had been going through the motions of this case, stood up and said something that shocked everyone in the courtroom. "Your Honor, I'd like to withdraw my objection to the evidence. I haven't actually reviewed the security footage or the witness statements. This case was presented to me by Officer Mitchell as a straightforward assault case, and based on what I'm hearing now, I think the defense is entitled to present their evidence. And if that evidence shows that Mr. Washington was acting in defense of another person, then the charges should be dismissed." Judge Whitmore looked at his prosecutor with betrayal and fury, because Chen had just undermined his authority, had sided with the defense, had forced him into a corner where he either had to allow the evidence or face obvious bias. And after a long, tense silence, Whitmore said through gritted teeth, "Fine, play the video." Rachel Martinez pulled out her laptop with shaking hands and connected it to the courtroom's display system. And for the next 3 minutes, the entire courtroom watched security camera footage from the gas station. Footage that showed Isaiah pulling into the parking lot, getting out of his car, and walking toward the convenience store. And then showed a man in the parking lot grabbing a woman and slamming her against a car, and showed the woman screaming and trying to get away. And showed Isaiah immediately running toward them and physically restraining the man, using what was clearly military combat training to control the assailant without injuring him, pinning him to the ground while telling the woman to call 911, and then showed Officer Mitchell arriving on scene, looking at the situation for approximately 5 seconds, and immediately going for Isaiah, pulling him off the assailant, throwing Isaiah to the ground, and handcuffing him, while the actual attacker got up and tried to leave before being stopped by another officer who arrived moments later. And the video showed the woman crying and pointing at Isaiah, and clearly trying to explain that he had helped her. But Officer Mitchell wasn't listening, was too focused on Isaiah, was treating him as the threat, and the racial dynamics of the situation were impossible to ignore. A white officer automatically assuming the black man was the criminal despite the white woman's protests. The courtroom was silent after the video ended, and Judge Whitmore sat on his bench looking like a man who had just realized he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. And Isaiah stood at the defense table with quiet dignity, not triumphant but sad. Sad that it had come to this. Sad that he'd had to fight so hard just to have the truth heard. Sad that his service and his honor hadn't been enough to earn him the benefit of the doubt. Rachel Martinez stood and said, "Your Honor, in light of this evidence, I move for immediate dismissal of all charges against my client. The video clearly shows that Sergeant Major Washington was acting in defense of another person, that he used appropriate force to stop an assault in progress, and that Officer Mitchell arrested the wrong person. And furthermore, the fact that Officer Mitchell wrote a police report that contradicts this video evidence suggests that he filed a false report, which is itself a crime, and I believe the district attorney's office should be investigating Officer Mitchell for perjury and filing a false police report." David Chen, the prosecutor, stood again and said, "Your Honor, the state concurs with the defense's motion. The charges should be dismissed immediately, and I'll be referring this matter to Internal Affairs for investigation of Officer Mitchell's conduct." Judge Whitmore had no choice now. He was cornered, exposed, forced to do the right thing not because he wanted to, but because he had no other option, and he said, his voice tight with suppressed rage and humiliation, The charges against Sergeant Major Isaiah Washington are hereby dismissed. This court apologizes for any inconvenience. You're free to go. But Isaiah didn't move, and that's when he delivered the final words that would truly change the courtroom, change Judge Whitmore's life, change the justice system in Phoenix. And he said, "Your Honor, I appreciate the dismissal of charges, but I don't accept your apology for any inconvenience. Because what happened here today wasn't an inconvenience. It was an attempted railroading of an innocent man. It was a judge who was so ready to believe the worst about a black veteran that he wouldn't even look at evidence of innocence. It was a justice system that values the word of a police officer over the testimony of citizens regardless of the facts. And it was a reminder that no amount of service, no number of medals, no level of sacrifice for this country can protect a black man from being presumed guilty in America. And I want everyone in this courtroom to understand something. I wasn't going to accept the 30 days in jail. I wasn't going to pay the $5,000 fine. I was going to appeal this case. I was going to take it to every level of the justice system until someone listened. Because I've fought for this country in ways most people can't imagine. I've bled for the Constitution. I've buried friends who died defending American values. And I'll be damned if I'm going to accept being convicted of a crime I didn't commit by a judge who couldn't be bothered to look at evidence before destroying my life." Isaiah paused, and his voice got quieter but somehow more powerful. "And Your Honor, I want you to think about something. I want you to think about all the other defendants who have stood where I'm standing, who didn't have video evidence, who didn't have witnesses, who didn't have medals that might make the prosecutor second-guess the police report, who were just regular people trying to tell the truth and being dismissed as criminals. How many of them did you send to jail without listening? How many lives did you destroy because you made assumptions about guilt based on race or appearance or class? How many families did you tear apart because you were more interested in moving cases than finding truth? And I want you to know that this case, this moment, this is going to follow you for the rest of your career, because I'm going to make sure of it. I'm going to file a formal complaint with the Arizona Commission on Judicial Conduct. I'm going to request a review of every case you've presided over in the last 5 years. I'm going to contact civil rights organizations and veterans advocacy groups. And I'm going to make sure that what happened here today becomes a case study in judicial bias. Because you tried to make an example of me, and instead, I'm going to make an example of you." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Whitmore's face cycled through emotions, rage, fear, shame, and he tried to respond, tried to defend himself. But Isaiah was already turning to leave, was already walking toward the courtroom exit with his head high and his bearing proud. But before he reached the door, a voice from the back of the courtroom called out, "Sergeant Major Washington, wait," and everyone turned to see who had spoken, and it was an elderly white man in a wheelchair. A man in his 70s with the same kind of medals on his jacket that Isaiah wore on his uniform, and the old man wheeled himself down the aisle and said, "I'm Colonel James Hartford, retired, United States Marine Corps, and I served with Sergeant Major Washington in Afghanistan. I was there the day he earned the Medal of Honor. I was one of the 47 men he saved. And I want Judge Whitmore and everyone in this courtroom to understand exactly who was almost sent to jail today." The courtroom went silent again, and Colonel Hartford looked at Judge Whitmore with contempt and said, "In 2009, Sergeant Major Washington was leading a Special Forces team in Helmand Province. They were ambushed by Taliban fighters, outnumbered 5 to 1, pinned down in a compound with no air support available, and they were taking casualties, and the Taliban were closing in, and everyone thought we were going to die there. But Sergeant Major Washington single-handedly held off the enemy for 6 hours while evacuating the wounded. He exposed himself to enemy fire repeatedly to pull injured soldiers to safety. He called in artillery strikes on his own position to stop the Taliban advance. He fought with his rifle until it jammed, then fought with his sidearm until it ran out of ammunition, then fought with a knife in his bare hands. And by the time reinforcements arrived, he had killed 32 enemy combatants, saved 47 American lives, and sustained 3 gunshot wounds and shrapnel injuries, and he refused medical evacuation until every other wounded soldier had been evacuated first. And that's who you just tried to send to jail, Judge Whitmore. That's the man whose service you dismissed as irrelevant. That's the hero you assumed was a criminal, and I want you to live with that. I want you to wake up every morning knowing that you nearly destroyed the life of one of the finest soldiers this country has ever produced, because you couldn't be bothered to look at evidence or question your own assumptions about a black man in your courtroom. Judge Whitmore looked like he wanted to disappear, looked like he wanted to crawl under his bench and hide from the judgment of everyone in the courtroom. But Colonel Hartford wasn't finished, and he wheeled his chair closer to the bench and said, "And I want you to know something else, Judge. I'm going to be joining Sergeant Major Washington in his complaint against you. I'm going to testify about what I saw here today. I'm going to use every connection I have in the military and in the legal community too. Make sure this case gets the attention it deserves, because I didn't survive Afghanistan just to watch the man who saved my life get railroaded by a biased judge in a Phoenix courtroom. And I suspect that when the media hears about this, when they learn that a Medal of Honor recipient was almost sent to jail without even being allowed to present evidence, you're going to face scrutiny that makes your current discomfort look like a vacation." What neither Isaiah nor Colonel Hartford knew yet, what was about to be revealed in a way that would make this story even more devastating for Judge Whitmore, was that this was not the first time the judge had shown bias in cases involving black defendants, and that revelation was about to come from an unexpected source, because in the back of the courtroom, a young black woman in a business suit stood up and said, "Excuse me, Your Honor, my name is Keisha Williams. I'm an investigative reporter for the Arizona Republic, and I've been sitting in your courtroom for the past 3 weeks as part of an investigation into racial disparities in sentencing in Arizona's municipal courts. And what I witnessed today, your treatment of Sergeant Major Washington, your refusal to consider evidence, your immediate assumption of guilt, that's been the pattern I've documented in 26 cases involving black defendants in your courtroom over the past month. And I have data showing that you sentence black defendants to jail at a rate 3 times higher than white defendants for similar offenses, that you deny bail to black defendants at twice the rate of white defendants, and that you dismiss defense evidence in cases involving black defendants at a significantly higher rate than in cases involving white defendants. And this story is going to be published tomorrow morning. And I think the Arizona Commission on Judicial Conduct is going to be very interested in these patterns." The courtroom exploded in reactions, gasps and murmurs, and the sound of reporters frantically typing. And Judge Whitmore's world was collapsing in real time, because this wasn't just one case that could be explained away. This was a pattern. This was data. This was evidence of systemic bias that would end his career, and he knew it, and his face showed that he knew it. Isaiah turned from the courtroom exit and looked at Judge Whitmore, and he felt not satisfaction but a deep sadness, because this judge was just one man, but he represented a system, represented thousands of judges and prosecutors and police officers who made assumptions about guilt based on race, who valued order over justice, who protected their authority more than they protected rights. And changing that system required more than just exposing one biased judge. It required a complete transformation of how America thought about crime and punishment, and who deserved the benefit of the doubt. But this moment, this courtroom, this exposure of Judge Whitmore's bias, it was a start. It was a crack in the facade. It was proof that when people spoke truth to power, when they refused to accept injustice quietly, when they demanded accountability, change was possible. And Isaiah looked at the judge and said his truly final words, the words that would be quoted in every article and every ethics investigation and every subsequent case that cited this moment. "Your Honor, you said that in your courtroom everyone is equal, and you were right. We should all be equal before the law, but equality requires more than just words. It requires judges who are willing to check their biases, to to question their assumptions, to look at evidence rather than relying on stereotypes. And it requires a justice system that sees black defendants as presumed innocent rather than presumed guilty. And I hope that what happened here today, the exposure of your bias, the documentation of your pattern of discrimination, I hope that becomes a catalyst for change, not just in your courtroom, but in courtrooms across this country. Because there are too many people who don't have the medals I have, who don't have the Colonel Hartfords to speak for them, who don't have the reporters documenting their cases, and they deserve justice too. They deserve to be heard, they deserve to have their evidence considered, and they deserve judges who understand that the power you wield, the authority to send people to jail, to destroy families, to ruin lives, that power requires humility and fairness, and a commitment to truth that goes beyond your personal prejudices. Isaiah walked out of the courtroom with Colonel Hartford wheeling beside him, and they were followed by Keisha Williams, the reporter, and by Rachel Martinez, the public defender, and by dozens of spectators who had witnessed something extraordinary. And as they emerged from the courthouse into the Phoenix sunshine, they were met by television cameras and reporters who had heard about the confrontation inside, and Isaiah gave an impromptu press conference on the courthouse steps, and he spoke about justice and bias and the need for systemic reform, and his words were measured and powerful and went viral within hours. And by that evening, Judge Thomas Whitmore had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, and by the end of the week, he had resigned from the bench rather than face formal disciplinary proceedings, and by the end of the month, the Arizona Supreme Court had launched a comprehensive review of sentencing disparities in municipal courts across the state, and Isaiah's case became the catalyst for reforms that would affect thousands of defendants. But the story of what happened in that Phoenix courtroom was about more than just one judge's downfall. It was about the power of speaking truth even when authority tries to silence you. It was about the importance of evidence and facts over assumptions and prejudices. It was about the value of service and sacrifice, and how those things should earn respect but can't protect against racism. And it was about the courage it takes to stand up for yourself, and for others who might not have the platform or the protection to fight back. Isaiah Washington became a national figure in the criminal justice reform movement, was invited to speak at law schools and judicial conferences, worked with civil rights organizations to develop bias training for judges and prosecutors, and used his platform to advocate for defendants who were facing the same kind of treatment he'd almost received. And he did all of this while continuing to work his regular job as a counselor for at-risk veterans, helping soldiers transition from military to civilian life, dealing with PTSD and homelessness, and the challenges of finding purpose after service. Colonel Hartford became one of Isaiah's closest allies in the reform work, and together they formed a veterans advocacy organization that provided legal support for former service members facing criminal charges, and they documented case after case of veterans being treated poorly by the justice system, being denied consideration for their service, being assumed to be dangerous or unstable because of their military background. And they fought to change policies and educate judges and create pathways for veterans to get treatment rather than incarceration. Keisha Williams won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigative series on racial bias in Arizona's courts, and her work led to the removal or resignation of 7 other judges who showed similar patterns of discrimination. And she became a leading voice in data-driven journalism about criminal justice. And she frequently collaborated with Isaiah to tell stories about individuals affected by systemic bias. Rachel Martinez, the public defender who had tried so hard to present Isaiah's evidence, became the director of her public defender's office and implemented new protocols for challenging judicial bias, training her attorneys to recognize patterns of discrimination and to fight back against judges who showed prejudice. And she credited Isaiah's case with giving her the courage to be more aggressive in defending her clients against judicial overreach. And the woman Isaiah had saved at the gas station, whose name was Maria Gonzalez, came forward to tell her story, to thank Isaiah publicly for his intervention, and to testify about how Officer Mitchell had ignored her attempts to explain what had happened. And her testimony became part of the internal affairs investigation that led to Officer Mitchell being fired from the Phoenix Police Department and charged with filing a false police report and perjury. 3 years after that day in court, Isaiah Washington stood on the same courthouse steps where he'd given his impromptu press conference. But this time he was there for a very different reason. He was there for the dedication of a memorial to victims of judicial bias, a stone monument inscribed with the names of people who had been wrongfully convicted or excessively sentenced by judges who let prejudice override evidence. And the monument included a quote from Isaiah's final words in Judge Whitmore's courtroom about equality requiring more than just words. And Isaiah spoke at the dedication ceremony. And he talked about the progress that had been made, but also about how much work remained, about how systemic change was slow and difficult and required constant vigilance. And he challenged the judges and lawyers and advocates in attendance to continue fighting for a justice system that truly treated everyone equally regardless of race or class or background. And in the audience that day was a face Isaiah hadn't expected to see. It was Thomas Whitmore, the former judge, who had come not to protest or to defend himself but to apologize. And after the ceremony, Whitmore approached Isaiah with obvious nervousness and said, "Sergeant Major Washington, I know you have no reason to listen to me, and I'm not asking or forgiveness because I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that what happened in my courtroom that day, it was the worst moment of my career and the best thing that could have happened to me, because it forced me to confront my own biases, to acknowledge that I had been treating people unfairly, to recognize that my assumptions about guilt and innocence were influenced by race in ways I'd refused to see. And I've spent the last 3 years in therapy and diversity training, and trying to understand how I became someone who could almost send an innocent man to jail without even looking at evidence. And I'm working with the Arizona Innocence Project now, trying to help overturn wrongful convictions, trying to make amends for the damage I did. And I wanted to tell you that, wanted you to know that your words, your courage, they changed me. They showed me who I had become and forced me to become someone different, someone better. Isaiah looked at this man who had tried to destroy his life, who had represented everything wrong with the justice system, and he felt the complexity of the moment, the desire for vengeance warring with the recognition that people could change, that accountability could lead to growth, that the point of exposing bias wasn't just punishment but transformation. And he extended his hand to Whitmore and said, "I appreciate you telling me that, and I appreciate the work you're doing now. But I need you to understand that changing yourself isn't enough. You need to speak out. You need to tell other judges about your biases. You need to be public about what you did wrong and how you're trying to make it right. Because there are thousands of judges who are doing what you did, who are letting their prejudices influence their decisions, and they need to hear from someone who lived it, someone who faced consequences. Someone who can tell them that it's possible to change, but only if you're willing to acknowledge the harm you've caused." Whitmore nodded, tears in his eyes, and he said, "I will, I promise I will. I've already started speaking at judicial conferences about my experience, about the bias I showed, about the patterns that Keisha Williams documented in my courtroom, and it's humiliating and painful, but it's necessary. And I owe it to every defendant I treated unfairly, every family I hurt, every person who sat in my courtroom and didn't get justice because of my prejudices." The two men shook hands, and photographers captured the moment, and it became another viral image, the Medal of Honor recipient and the disgraced judge finding a path toward reconciliation. And the image sparked conversations about accountability and redemption, and whether people who abuse power deserve second chances. And there were no easy answers, but the conversation itself was valuable. The grappling with complexity was important. The recognition that justice required both consequences and the possibility of change. 5 years after the confrontation in court, the reforms that had been sparked by Isaiah's case had spread beyond Arizona. 12 states had implemented new judicial bias training programs. The American Bar Association had adopted new ethics guidelines about racial disparities in sentencing, and federal legislation was being considered that would require data collection on sentencing patterns by race in all federal courts. And while these changes were incremental and imperfect, they represented progress. They represented thousands of individual cases where defendants were treated more fairly, where evidence was considered more carefully, where judges checked their assumptions. And Isaiah understood that this was how systemic change happened, not through one dramatic moment, but through sustained effort, through telling the story over and over, through documenting the patterns, through holding people accountable, through refusing to accept that bias was inevitable or unchangeable. And on the 7th anniversary of that day in Judge Whitmore's courtroom, Isaiah received a letter from a young black man named Marcus Johnson, who had been facing charges in Phoenix, and whose public defender had cited Isaiah's case in challenging the judge's bias. And the charges had been dismissed when the judge reviewed the evidence more carefully and recognized that he'd been making assumptions. And Marcus wrote to thank Isaiah, wrote to tell him that he'd gone on to finish college and was now in law school studying criminal justice reform, and he wanted to become a judge someday, wanted to be the kind of judge who listened to evidence and questioned assumptions, and treated every defendant with dignity. And he said that Isaiah's courage had inspired him to believe that the system could change, that one person's stand could ripple forward in ways they couldn't predict. Isaiah read that letter and thought about all the people who had supported him, Colonel Hartford and Keisha Williams and Rachel Martinez and Aria Gonzalez and the countless others who had stood up against bias in their own ways. And he thought about Judge Whitmore, who was now working to undo some of the harm he'd caused. And he thought about Marcus Johnson and all the future lawyers and judges and advocates who were being inspired to create change. And he understood that the final words he'd spoken in that courtroom 7 years ago, the words about equality requiring more than just rhetoric, about the need for humility and fairness and truth, those words hadn't been final at all. They'd been a beginning. They'd been the start of a conversation that was still ongoing, a movement that was still building, a transformation that was still unfolding. And his role in that transformation wasn't finished, would never be finished as long as there were people facing injustice who needed someone to speak up, to stand firm, to refuse to accept that bias was inevitable. And so Isaiah Washington continued his work, continued speaking at conferences and training judges and advocating for defendants and mentoring young people like Marcus Johnson. And he wore his Medal of Honor not as a shield against criticism or a claim to special treatment, but as a reminder of the values he'd sworn to defend, the Constitution and the rights it guaranteed, the promise of equal justice under law, the ideal that every person deserved dignity and fairness regardless of their race or background. And he understood that the battle he'd fought in that Phoenix courtroom was the same battle he'd fought in Afghanistan. It was the fight for principles over prejudice, for truth over assumptions, for justice over convenience. And it was a battle worth fighting every day for the rest of his life, because the words that had changed that courtroom, the truth he'd spoken to a judge who thought he could silence him, those words still echoed, still mattered, still had power, and they would continue to change courtrooms and lives and systems as long as people had the courage to speak them, to demand accountability, to refuse to be silent in the face of injustice. And that courage, that refusal to accept being silenced, that was the real meaning of service. That was the truest form of patriotism. That was what it meant to defend the Constitution, not just on foreign battlefields, but in American courtrooms where the promise of equal justice was tested every single day.